There was a time Ava thought silence meant peace. Now, it only reminded her of all the unanswered calls, the unreturned messages, the birthdays spent staring at a phone that never rang. In her minimalist office overlooking the San Francisco skyline, success surrounded her. Glowing monitors, glass walls, polished awards. But none of it filled the quiet that echoed with her parents' absence. Tonight, as the city lights flickered below, Ava replayed the last voicemail she ever sent them. Her voice trembling, hopeful, begging for acknowledgement. They never replied. That silence became her motivation. Now, years later, she wasn't the one calling. Her assistant would be. And for the first time, her parents would have to listen. The next morning began with the illusion of calm. A sky washed in silver fog, the kind that makes the city feel like a memory. Ava moved through her routine mechanically. Espresso, emails, unread texts. The message to her parents was gone, sent by Maya in quiet defiance. Now it was waiting, like a storm hovering on the horizon. For years she had begged for attention. Now she commanded it. Yet beneath that resolve, an ache lingered. A whisper, asking what would happen if they never replied. Even now, Maya arrived early, eyes scanning Ava for signs of relief that never came. The office was quiet except for the faint hum of the espresso machine. "They'll see it?" Maya said softly. Ava only nodded, gaze fixed on the skyline. She wasn't sure what scared her more, their response or their silence. In Oregon, miles away, the Morgans' quiet house hummed with the sound of a ringing phone. Daniel paused his morning paper. Eleanor looked up from her coffee. The name Ava Morgan flashed on the screen, but the voice they would hear this time wouldn't be hers. When Maya's voice finally crossed the line, calm and professional, Daniel's hand trembled. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan. This is Maya Torres, calling on behalf of Ava Morgan." The silence on his end was the same one Ava had known her whole life, only now it was filled with something else. Consequence. The sound of Maya's voice lingered in the Oregon kitchen long after the call had ended. Daniel's fingers drummed nervously on the table, the newspaper forgotten. Eleanor whispered her daughter's name like a prayer she wasn't sure she had the right to say. For years, they had convinced themselves Ava was better off without them, that her silence mirrored theirs. But hearing her name from a stranger, formal and distant, cracked something open. They didn't know what hurt more, the reminder of their neglect, or the realization that Ava no longer needed them to speak for herself. She had people who did that now. In San Francisco, Ava reviewed investor reports as if nothing had happened. She didn't ask Maya about the call, didn't need to. The silence that followed told her everything. Yet beneath her poise, her pulse raced. Somewhere across the miles, her parents had heard her name again, and that was enough. For now, Eleanor wandered into the garden that afternoon, the same one where she used to read, while Ava played in the grass. The autumn leaves whispered memories, and guilt tangled with the wind. She thought of the daughter who once called just to say goodnight, the one she'd told to call later, until later never came. Now, that same daughter had an assistant to call for her. The realization hollowed her out from the inside. Daniel sat alone in his study, surrounded by the trophies of a life built on pride. His law degree, framed newspaper clippings, the heavy oak desk, symbols of control that now mocked him. For years, he had justified ignoring Ava as teaching her strength, but all he had taught her was to live without him. The call wasn't a reconciliation. It was a reminder. His daughter had become untouchable. That night, Maya quietly handed Ava a report marked with updates. At the top was a new email, one sent by Eleanor Morgan. Ava didn't open it. She only stared at the subject line. "I'm sorry." Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. Some apologies come too late, and some are better left unread. Still, a part of her The part that once waited by the phone hesitated. The silence had cracked. Now she had to decide whether to let it break completely. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat at the top of Ava's screen. The email from her mother remained unopened, glowing faintly against the darkness of her office. Maya had left hours ago, and only the low hum of the city remained. Ava told herself she didn't care. That closure was for the weak. Yet her reflection in the glass disagreed. There was no vengeance in her stillness, only ache. For the first time in years, she hovered between two choices: delete the message or read the apology that had come too late. In Oregon, Eleanor waited by her computer, the glow of the monitor painting her face with pale anticipation. She had rewritten that email a dozen times, deleting, rewriting, erasing again. How do you apologize for absence? For years of not picking up? She imagined Ava's eyes reading her words, imagined rejection, and typed anyway. Because guilt, when left unspoken, becomes its own kind of silence. Ava finally opened the email. The words were short, awkward, human, trembling between guilt and love. I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you're happy. It wasn't enough, and yet it was something. She read it once, twice, 3 times. The tears didn't come, but the air felt heavier, denser. She closed the message without replying, saving it like evidence of a wound that had finally been acknowledged. Later that night, Ava found herself standing on her balcony, city wind tangling her hair. For so long, she had imagined this moment, her parents reaching out, her heart vindicated. But instead of triumph, she felt something stranger. Peace, cautious and fragile. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about letting them back in. Maybe it was about finally letting herself stop waiting. The next morning, Maya entered quietly, setting a latte on Ava's desk. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. Ava smiled faintly. "No," she replied, eyes on the skyline. "But I think I finally woke up." The bitterness that once defined her had softened, not gone, but reshaped. She didn't need an apology to be whole anymore. The silence that once haunted her had finally answered back. And that was enough. Days passed before Daniel found the courage to send his own message. He wrote, without eloquence, without polish. Just a father stumbling over his guilt. "You deserved better." He hovered over the send button, his reflection wavering in the laptop screen. For years his pride had been his armor. Now it felt like a prison. When the email finally left his outbox, the quiet afterward felt heavier than before. The weight of too much time gone. Ava never saw the email right away. Her company was preparing for an acquisition. Meetings, calls, decisions stacked like armor plates around her. The life she had built, brick by brick from rejection, had become its own fortress. Her phone buzzed endlessly, but never with anything she wanted to hear. She'd built a world so high above her past that sometimes she forgot how far she'd climbed to escape it. Meanwhile, Eleanor started sorting through old boxes in the attic. Each photo, each memento carried the weight of everything unsaid. There was Ava's kindergarten drawing, her first science fair ribbon, a note that said, "Call me after work, Mom. I miss you." The air grew heavy with dust and regret. Eleanor sat down among the relics, clutching the small, faded note like a confession. When Ava finally noticed her father's message, it was by accident, buried between corporate memos and board updates. For a long moment, she just stared at the sender's name. She didn't open it. Not yet. She couldn't decide what frightened her more: his words, or the possibility that he might actually mean them this time. Forgiveness wasn't a simple act. It was reopening a wound you'd already learned to live with. She didn't reply. Instead, she called Maya into her office. "Send them an invite," Ava said quietly, "to the launch." Maya looked at her, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "Both of them," Yes, Ava said, her voice steady. If they want to see the life they ignored, I'll give them a front row seat. There was no anger in her tone, only resolve, polished like steel. The night of the launch was a symphony of glass, light, and applause. Cameras flashed as Ava stepped onto the stage, her name rippling through the crowd like electricity. She had imagined this moment, not for revenge, but for proof that she had built something no one could ignore. In the audience, two unfamiliar silhouettes sat stiffly near the back, her parents, smaller than she remembered. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. She didn't flinch. The silence that once defined her now served her. Poised, powerful, untouchable. As she spoke, her voice was steady, measured, resonant. Success isn't built on perfection, she said, but on resilience. Her words hung in the air, half for her audience, half for herself. The applause that followed was thunderous, but she barely heard it. For the first time, Ava felt entirely in control of her own story. Her parents had taken her silence once. Tonight, she reclaimed it. At the reception, laughter and conversation filled the air like a storm of glass and perfume. Daniel and Eleanor moved hesitantly through the crowd, invisible among Ava's colleagues and investors. When they finally reached her, Ava turned slowly, a polite smile masking the 1,000 emotions buried beneath. "Mom, Dad," the words felt foreign, distant, like speaking through a window. Eleanor's eyes welled up, but Ava didn't reach for her. Not yet. Daniel spoke first, his voice rough, uncertain. "You've done well, Ava." The compliment fell flat, too small for the years it was meant to heal. Eleanor tried to smile, but tears betrayed her. "We're proud of you," she whispered. Ava nodded politely. "Thank you for coming." The conversation ended there. A lifetime condensed into 4 brittle words. Around them, cameras flashed. To everyone else, it looked like a family reunion. To Ava, it was closure. When the night ended, Ava stood by the exit as her parents left. Eleanor paused, wanting to say more, but Ava's gentle nod stopped her. "Take care," Ava said. Not coldly, but with finality. As the doors closed behind them, she exhaled. The applause, the flashing lights, the quiet ache, it all merged into one truth. She no longer needed to be heard by them. She had become her own voice. The gala lights had faded, replaced by the hum of rain on glass. Ava sat alone in her office once again, her gown draped over the chair, her makeup smudged into something human. She replayed the night in her mind, her parents' faces, their trembling smiles, the brittle politeness between them. No arguments, no tears. Just the quiet realization that closure doesn't roar, it whispers. She had waited years for a moment that ended in silence, and somehow, that felt right. In Oregon, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was too quiet. He had imagined that seeing Ava would fix something, that pride could dissolve into forgiveness with a single meeting. But all he felt was the ache of years he couldn't undo. He had mistaken silence for strength. Now he understood it was cowardice. Beside him, Eleanor turned, whispering into the dark. "Do you think she'll ever forgive us?" Daniel didn't answer. He already knew. Eleanor rose before dawn, unable to sleep. She walked into the kitchen and found Ava's old photograph pinned to the fridge, 10 years old, missing a front tooth, holding a homemade best daughter card she had made herself. Eleanor's chest tightened. She realized that forgiveness wasn't something Ava owed them. It was something she would have to earn, quietly, through the rest of her days. Meanwhile, Maya found Ava on the balcony, barefoot, hair tousled by the wind. "You did what you had to," she said softly. Ava didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the fog met the first blush of dawn. "Do you regret it?" Maya asked. Ava shook her head slowly. "No, I just wish they'd called when I was still waiting." The words hung there, a final admission, quiet but unshakable. Later that day, Ava drafted a message. Short, composed, final. "Thank you for coming last night. I hope you both take care." She stared at it for a long time before pressing send. There would be no long explanations, no reopenings of old wounds. She had given them her success, her silence, and now, her peace. For the first time, her heart felt weightless. The past no longer reached her. She had outgrown its echo. Weeks passed. The world spun on. Meetings, interviews, awards. Ava's name filled headlines. Her face graced magazine covers. Yet, when the noise faded each night, she found herself craving quiet again. But this time, it didn't sting. Silence was no longer a punishment. It was a home she had built herself. She had turned absence into armor and solitude into grace. Somewhere in Oregon, her parents were probably watching the same interviews she once wished they'd seen. Now she hoped they did. Not for her validation, but for their understanding of what their silence had created. Not bitterness, but strength. In Oregon, Daniel began to volunteer at a community center. It was small work, legal advice for people who couldn't afford it, but it made him feel useful again. He never spoke about Ava, though he thought of her every day. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about being forgiven. It was about becoming someone who deserved to be. Eleanor found her way back to painting. Something she had abandoned years ago when life became too heavy. Her first piece was a portrait of a little girl sitting by a window, phone in hand, waiting. She didn't name it Ava. She didn't have to. Every brushstroke was an apology, every color a confession. She didn't send a picture of it. Some gestures, she knew now, weren't meant to be seen, only felt. On a quiet Sunday morning, Ava walked along the Embarcadero, the wind crisp with salt and sunrise. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't look. The sound didn't control her anymore. She stopped by the water's edge, watching seagulls cut through the pink light. Somewhere deep inside, the child who once waited by the phone finally smiled. Silence wasn't the absence of love. It was the space where she had learned to love herself. That evening, Ava returned home and turned off her phone. She poured herself tea, opened the balcony doors, and listened. To nothing. To everything. The hum of the city, the whisper of the wind, her own breathing. For years, she had chased answers, apologies, noise. But now, the silence was hers. It no longer echoed with absence. It sang with peace. Revenge had never been external. Justice had never been external. The only thing she truly needed was this, to know she was finally free.